I'm Bill Fleming. What you have just seen is a sample of college football in the 70s. In preparing this program for your exclusive home video cassette entertainment, we had to view more than 700 games played during these past 10 years, and a description of every play from those 700 games was logged in this book. And from that, we chose what we think to be the very best. Whether this is your first sports tape from Magnetic Video or whether you're adding it to your sports library, it's going to be a very valuable addition. You're going to receive many hours of enjoyment recalling some of those memorable moments in America's most colorful sport, college football. So, let's go to the top of the decade, to that first year, a memorable one it was too, 1970. The decade of the 70s began with two teams sharing national championship honors, the Longhorns of Texas and the Cornhuskers of Nebraska. Texas roared through the Southwest Conference with a perfect 7-0 record. They were led by the scoring leader of the league, fullback Steve Worcester, the first great running back out of the wishbone offense. A two-time All-America player, and for 3 years voted to the All-Conference team. In his senior year, he compiled a brilliant 5.6-yard average and scored 14 touchdowns. He was voted the most valuable player on the Texas squad in 1970. Today, Steve Worcester owns the Lone Star Beer Distributorship in San Antonio, Texas, but he still basks in the glory that was his in Austin. As a sophomore, little Johnny Rogers of Nebraska teamed up with quarterback Jerry Taggy to lead the Cornhuskers to a national co-championship with Texas. Rogers flashed the form in 70 that would eventually lead him to All-America honors and the coveted Heisman Trophy. We'll be seeing him really turning it on a little bit later, but this is a pretty good example of his great ability. The Fighting Irish of Notre Dame contributed 2 players to the All-America squad of 1970, Tom Gatewood and Walt Patulski. Gatewood was a 3-year starter at split end for the Irish, and at the end of the decade, he still held Irish records for career receptions and touchdowns. He had all the ingredients of a great receiver, the most important of which was speed and the ability to get free. That, with his smart football sense, made him a perfect choice in Ara Parseghian's offensive machine. The Irish defense in 1970 was led by defensive end Walt Patulski, number 85. He made the All-America squad as a junior. 1 year later, he would team with Gatewood as co-captain of the Irish in the year they scored their biggest victory, the one over Texas in the Cotton Bowl, when they became the first team to really break the wishbone. Patulski, at 6'6" and 260 pounds, was just about as punishing a defensive player as the Irish ever had. Many times, his quick penetration would set up the tackle for his teammates. But more often than not, he would be credited with a solo. After his final year at Notre Dame, Walt Patulski was the top draft choice of the Buffalo Bills. However, he never really reached the heights that many thought he would attain in pro ball. Nagging injuries cut his career short. Today, he's a businessman in Syracuse, New York. But his feats at Notre Dame will long be remembered. Franco Harris was destined to become one of the greatest pro running backs in history with the Pittsburgh Steelers. During his collegiate career at Penn State, he rushed for 2,002 yards. This was all the more surprising since he shared backfield duties with Lydell Mitchell, who was Penn State's all-time rushing leader with nearly 3,000 yards. No one who followed Penn State football was surprised when the 235-pound Harris was a first-round draft choice of the Steelers, where he became an instant hero, just as he was at Penn State. Ohio State's middle guard, Jim Stillwagon, number 68, and his teammate Buckeye linebacker Jack Tatum, who wore number 32, both won All-America honors in 1970. Tatum was just about as fierce a player as the Buckeyes ever had at his position. He was always able to force the big defensive play. He and Stillwagon combined on many defensive thrusts. Oftentimes, their hard hitting would cause a fumble, like it did here against arch-rival Michigan. Stillwagon also won both top national honors for linemen in 1970, the Outland and the Lombardi trophies. In his final home game against Michigan, the OSU co-captain was phenomenal. He had 12 solo tackles and a dozen more assists, as he and Tatum led a defensive charge that resulted in a 20-9 victory and a Big Ten championship. Stillwagon and Tatum were both part of that freshman class of '67 recruited by Woody Hayes, called by most the finest ever at Ohio State. 14 of those players were drafted by the pros. 4 of them were first-round picks. Stillwagon played his first year in Toronto and was named All-Canadian Defensive Lineman after that rookie season. Tatum became one of the most feared defensive players in the NFL with the Oakland Raiders. He began the new decade with the Houston Oilers. When football fans recall the past, they have a particular admiration for 2 of the Buckeyes' best, Stillwagon and Tatum. The player who was accorded the top honor in college football in the year of 1970 was Stanford quarterback Jim Plunkett. For 3 straight years, he led his conference in passing. In his senior year, he guided Stanford to the league title and a berth in the Rose Bowl. He then passed them to a 27-17 victory over Ohio State. The total offense career mark of Plunkett still stands as the high water mark in conference statistics. His 8,178-yard total may never be surpassed. No one yet has come within 500 yards of it. He threw to so many different receivers: Bataha, Brown, Lassiter, and more. Perhaps his most crucial assignment came in the game against Washington. Going into that game, Plunkett was number 2 in the nation in passing. His opponent was Sonny Sixkiller of Washington, who was rated number 1. What a duel those two staged that day in Palo Alto. Washington trailed 21-14 in the 4th quarter. On a 4th down play, Sixkiller scrambled. Somehow, he was able to spot an opening, and he scored a Washington touchdown, making the score 21-20 Stanford. Then Sixkiller changed all that very quickly with another scrambling play. Going for 2, he spots Ace Bolger, number 85. And Bolger grabs the ball for the 2-point conversion, and Washington leads 22-21. But Plunkett was a master under pressure, and everything was hanging in the balance: the conference championship, the Rose Bowl, even the Heisman. He fired this touchdown pass to Randy Bataha, giving the Cardinals a 29-22 victory. Plunkett's amazing career continued into the 80s with the Oakland Raiders. One of college football's most unusual plays occurred during the 1970 season in the game between Alabama and LSU. The ball was bobbled around several times and finally wound up in the end zone of Alabama, covered by Alabama. Coach Charlie McClendon argued that it should be a safety, that LSU should get 2 points. He claimed the impetus that put the ball in the end zone was supplied by Alabama. The officials ruled otherwise. They called it merely a touchback. Well, let's look at it again. LSU quarterback Bert Jones laterals to fullback Alan Shorey. When Shorey is hit, the ball pops loose, is taken in midair by Alabama's Ed Hines. He tries to lateral to a teammate, but the ball goes into the end zone, where it's covered by Ed Norris of the Tide. Well, it could have been ruled either way. As it turned out, LSU won the game 14-9. The Coach of the Year award of 1970 went to Alex Agassi of Northwestern, who took his undermanned Wildcats to a 2nd-place finish in the Big Ten. The Nebraska Cornhuskers had to share a national title in 1970, not so in 1971, when they won it outright with their greatest team ever. Coach Bob Devaney felt justifiably optimistic before the season. He had all the ingredients: a strong defense, the quarterbacking of Jerry Tagge, and the power and explosiveness of runners like Jeff Kinney and Johnny Rogers. Here's how the coach looked at the upcoming season.
Our strong points for the 1971 season, I believe, could well be in the amount or the number of fine defensive football players we have returning. We have 7 of our 11 starters back from last year's fine defensive unit. And then we have our 2 quarterbacks returning that played a very important part in the last 2 conference champions and last year's national champion. I believe these factors, as far as individuals, plus the tremendous desire that Nebraska teams have shown to win, I think, are the strongest points we have going for us.
A little later on, we'll see the Nebraska team in action in the Oklahoma game of '71, the game of the decade. The Ivy League contributed their first player in 5 years to the All-America squad, Ed Marinaro of Cornell, the most prolific scorer in the history of the league. His 52 touchdowns and 6 extra points gave him an average of 16.4 points per game, third highest ever in college football. After a brief pro career with the Vikings and the Jets, an injury to his foot caused him to give up football, and he launched a new career as an actor in Hollywood. When you go back and look at the running of Johnny Musso of Alabama, you can see why he made such a lasting impression on the pages of the SEC and Alabama record books. No runner in Tide history carried the ball more or gained as many yards as Musso. His durability was absolutely phenomenal. In 1971, he averaged 22 carries per game, and throughout the season, posted a brilliant 108.8 yards average per game. Johnny Musso was the big reason the Tide was able to come off a 6-5-1 mediocre season in 1970 to a perfect 10-0 season's record and the SEC championship in 1971. Johnny Musso concluded his pro career with the Chicago Bears in the late 70s and then retired from football to become a businessman in the city of Chicago. The Wolverines of Michigan had a workhorse of their own in '71, halfback Billy Taylor, their most valuable player and All-America selection. Here was a runner of such superb balance, it was almost impossible to take him down one-on-one. Perhaps no touchdown gave him more pleasure than the one he scored in his last home game against Ohio State. It was the only touchdown of the game, and it gave Michigan a victory over the Buckeyes, 10-7. The win preserved the perfect regular season record at 11-0 for the Wolverines as they headed for the Rose Bowl. For Billy Taylor, who later had some personal problems before he got things straightened out, this was one of the happiest moments of his entire life. There was a controversial play that occurred in that game that fans still talk about. With Ohio State trailing 10-7 late in the fourth quarter, they had a 3rd and 16 situation. But as you can see, Don Lampke's pass intended for Wakefield was intercepted by Michigan's All-America defensive back Tom Darden. Coach Woody Hayes was convinced there was interference on that play. He went out to argue his point with the officials. Let's look at it again. From this angle and at this speed, it appears as if Darden makes the catch cleanly. But now, if we freeze the picture at several critical points, it appears as if Coach Hayes had a valid complaint. In this picture, Darden is still not making contact with Wakefield. If we advance the picture just a few frames, we see Darden coming closer. And now, with the ball a considerable distance from the receiver, it looks as if Darden has made body contact in his efforts to get to the ball. Here, it looks like he definitely has hampered Wakefield's chances to catch it. Wakefield's head and shoulders are bent forward from the defensive pressure. And then, of course, Darden comes up with the football. Still just judging the way the play occurred at normal speed, it's difficult to see what really happened. Be that as it may, Michigan won the game 10-7, giving the Wolverines an undefeated season and an outright Big Ten title and a trip to the Rose Bowl. For some, a rather cumbersome souvenir. The Eagle mascot of Auburn was a proud one in 1971, as Auburn not only contributed 2 players to the All-America team, but also the Heisman Trophy winner in Pat Sullivan. His favorite target was All-America receiver Terry Beasley, consensus choice at split end. During his career, Beasley caught 29 touchdown passes in 30 games, an SEC record. And during his career, he averaged better than 17 yards per catch. Terry Beasley played with the 49ers until an injury sidelined him. Today, he runs a successful landscaping business in his hometown of Prattville, Alabama. And today also, Terry Beasley is still a very active Auburn alumnus. He never misses an Auburn football game. On On the throwing end of this combination was Pat Sullivan, who came to Auburn after a brilliant prep career in Birmingham. He lived up to all that was expected of him. He was responsible for 71 touchdowns during his 3 years. That still is a Southeastern Conference record. As so often happens when there's a great passer at quarterback, the defenses are wary. They're always looking for that big pass that can kill them. That's why so often the misdirection and draw plays would work so well, like this one. And that's what made the combination of Sullivan and Beasley so devastating. When you talk to Auburn fans who saw them play, invariably they'll shake their heads and say, there'll never be another dynamic duo like those two. Sullivan is the only Auburn player to win the Heisman Trophy, and only the 4th player from the SEC to win that coveted award. His career in pro ball with Atlanta never really blossomed. Today he owns an insurance agency in his hometown of Birmingham. But for Pat Sullivan, the most memorable moment in his life came when he was informed that he had won the Heisman Trophy. But who wouldn't be inspired to great heights with such Auburn beauties on the sidelines? The year 1972 proved to be another great one for the Trojans of Southern California, the only team in major college football to have a perfect record that season, 12-0. They climaxed the year with a victory over Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, so it's little wonder they were named #1 in the nation. Under the astute coaching of John McKay, the Trojans scored more points than any other USC team since the fabulous offensive machine of 1929 under Howard Jones. The secret of the Trojans' success? Coach McKay talked about it after being named Coach of the Year.
We give our football team, the players on the team, a lot of ability to make their own decisions. We audibilize or change the play on the line of scrimmage quite often. We very seldom send in plays. We try to train our quarterback that he can do that. And basically that's it, and that we want to be in better condition than the other team. We don't care whether we're bigger or not, though sometimes we are bigger. But we want to be out-conditioning the other team.
Defensive tackle John Grant was one of the reasons for the Trojans' success on defense. He was singled out by John McKay as simply the best defensive player he ever had at USC. 230 pounds is not really very heavy for a defensive tackle, yet Grant turned his into about as destructive a force as one could imagine. He later became a member of the Denver Broncos, one of 37 USC players to be on the NFL roster at the end of the decade. Offensively, All-America tight end Charlie Young was the guy the Trojans called on in tough situations. He was called the Tree because of his massive torso and long arms. He caught more passes than any other tight end in Trojan history. 6 of his touchdown passes came in the Rose Bowl, and look at him block out ahead of a ball carrier. He continued his football career into the 80s as a tight end with the San Francisco 49ers, and he was the NFL's Rookie of the Year in his first year of 1973. The Seminoles of Florida State produced an All-America quarterback in 1972 in Gary Huff. As a junior the previous year, he led the nation in total offense, the first FSU player to win a national title. His performance in '72 was all the more noteworthy since injuries decimated the Seminole running game and all of the defenses were set to stop Huff. He still managed to become the nation's second-ranked passer. Beginning the 80s, Gary was the backup quarterback with the San Francisco 49ers. Otis Armstrong of Purdue was the Big Ten's most valuable player in '72, finishing his collegiate career with 3,315 yards, Purdue's all-time best. He still holds Purdue's single-game rushing mark of 276 yards. His greatest asset, other than the ability to break the big play, has been his durability. Injury was never a problem with Otis Armstrong. He still continues his outstanding football career as a running back with the Denver Broncos. Greg Pruitt was twice named as a consensus All-America with the Oklahoma Sooners. He and quarterback Jack Milgren proved to be a devastating 1-2 punch, gaining over 1,000 yards apiece during the '71 season. But with Milgren gone in '72, Pruitt still was the man most responsible for taking the Sooners through a 10-1 season, and then a 14-0 victory over Penn State in the Sugar Bowl. One record Greg is most proud of that still stands is his 3-year career rushing average, a whopping 7.7 yards per carry. Not bad for a player who never weighed more than 177 pounds. He now is a running back with the Cleveland Browns. Great success was predicted for 280-pound offensive guard John Hanna of the Crimson Tide of Alabama, who was never bothered about not getting headlines in college as he cleared the way for the Tide's running backs.
Yeah, I've had more than my fair share of publicity being an offensive lineman. I know there's a lot that don't, but before I did get some of that publicity, I was happy just when we won the game or when our offensive backs ran the ball well, because they can't gain much yardage unless somebody's blocking. So I take that into consideration and let that be my goal.
John Hanna is still all-pro caliber with New England. By the way, at 282 pounds, he was the second heaviest rookie ever drafted. Bubba Smith at 283 was the heaviest. During his collegiate days, Brad Van Pelt did just about everything at Michigan State. He won 7 letters in 3 sports. He turned down a $100,000 bonus offer to play baseball so that he could play his final season of football with the Spartans. At 6'5" and 225, he was the biggest safety man in college football. In 1972, he was the winner of the Maxwell Trophy. And going into the 80s, he was still playing football with the New York Giants as a linebacker. The winner of the 1972 Heisman Trophy was little 5'9", 173-pound Johnny Rodgers of Nebraska, the most exciting player ever to wear a Cornhusker uniform. Throughout his career, he scored a touchdown in every 9 plays. His style of running was dazzling. Johnny Rodgers averaged 13.8 yards every time he touched the football. And he was tough, as well as being nifty. After playing pro ball in Montreal and in San Diego, he is now retired and is in business in San Diego. These were his thoughts when he accepted the Heisman Trophy in '72.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Honored guests at the head table. I didn't really prepare a speech tonight because I felt that I probably would be too nervous to read my own writing, and I was right. I can't even hardly hear what I'm saying. I would just like to know that, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to make it, and I am going to go forward, and I am going to do a lot better things than I've already feel that I've done now. And I'd like everyone to know that on my way up, I'm going to try my damnedest to reach down to both younger people, both black and white. And so whoever grabs a hold, I hope to pull up with me. And I want to know that everybody who needs somebody, that I would like to be a part of them, because I realized that I couldn't have done it by myself. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight to share with me the best moment in my best evening in my first 21 years of life. And I feel that in my next 21 years, I hope I do as well. Somehow, if I manage to do this.
Johnny Rodgers' jersey, number 20, has been retired. Only one of 3 Cornhuskers to be given that lofty honor. One last look at Johnny Rodgers in his final game, in the '73 Orange Bowl game, where he was the entire show. The victory, 40-6 over Notre Dame. Johnny Rodgers accounted for 4 touchdowns. He wanted to prove that his selection as the Heisman winner was no mistake. Once again, in 1973, the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame gained the ultimate heights in college football, being named the national champions. It was a season to remember, and there were many stars to be remembered, like defensive back and safety man Mike Townsend. He led the nation as the best interceptor in 1972 as a junior, and his very presence in the secondary as a senior prevented passes being thrown by the opposition. Mike was a native of Hamilton, Ohio, who was guided in his life by his mother. He felt so much affection toward her that when others took wives and girlfriends to the Hula Bowl in Honolulu, Mike took his mom. Tight end Dave Casper will go down as one of the greatest tight ends ever to play college football. He was described by athletic director Moose Krause as the greatest and most inspirational captain in the history of Notre Dame football. His coach, Ara Parsekian, claimed that Casper had the best pair of hands he'd ever seen. He certainly was the most versatile athlete ever to play at Notre Dame. In one season, he was a guard, a tackle, he was the punter on the team, and also the tight end. With Casper leading the way, Notre Dame recorded a perfect 11-0 season, climaxing it with a dramatic win over Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, 24-23. Dave Casper went on to star with the Oakland Raiders and was selected at the end of the decade as the NFL's first-team tight end of the 70s. He began the new decade with the Houston Oilers. A player destined for stardom the moment he set foot on the campus at USC was wide receiver Lynn Swann. He became an All-America college player and then went on to star with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Seldom has college football seen a more determined athlete or a more versatile one. Whatever he was asked to do, he was the best there was in '73. Watch him block here. He single-handedly annihilates two men. Swann led the Trojans in receiving, and in 1973 became their all-time pass-receiving leader with 95 catches and 11 touchdowns. Lynn Swann's desire to get the ball into the end zone was almost an obsession. He would not be denied. Roger Staubach's successor as quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys was Danny White, an All-America quarterback for Arizona State in 1973. He actually went to Arizona State as a baseball star, even though 23 years before, his father Wilford had led the nation in rushing and was a first-team Little All-America player. Danny became a master at picking opponents apart. He threw the football just about as accurately as he did a baseball. Some of his records still stand at ASU. Most touchdown passes, 59. Most yards, 5,932. And no less than 5 NCAA passing records that he set are still intact, 7 years after Danny White had left the campus. There was in 1973 a defensive nose guard by the name of Lucius Selman, who is described to this day by veteran Oklahoma football observers as the best ever to play for the Sooners. He was the first of 3 brothers to play for Oklahoma. The other 2 who followed were Dewey and Leroy. During his collegiate career, the Sooners won 32 out of their 35 games. He returned to his alma mater in 1976 to become defensive line coach. And along about 1993, looked for another Selman, his son Lucius III, to be wearing the colors of Oklahoma. For boundless enthusiasm, it was hard to match 258-pound tackle John Hicks of Ohio State, one of the best for tough, close-in blocking for the quarterback. Look at this hole. But what John Hicks really delighted in was cutting a swath through the defensive line so the Buckeye backs like Archie Griffin could go roaring through on the way to the end zone. Hicks was so effective and so dominating that he was voted both the Outland and Lombardi trophies in 1973 as the nation's top lineman. With Hicks on that Big Ten and championship Rose Bowl team was All-America linebacker Randy Gradishaw. A trademark of his was that he never left any part of his job unfinished. Ball carriers took his full force when he hit them, and oftentimes he shocked them into a fumble. But what pleased Ohio State fans most was when Gradishaw would simply bury an opponent. The University of Missouri boasted one of the nation's top defensive backs in '73, a walk-on by the name of John Mosley, 5'9", 162, who specialized in punt returns. Just watch this remarkable run. you'll understand why his coach Al Onofrio called him the grittiest player he ever saw. Despite being stopped 6 times in this run against SMU, he returned it 74 yards, one of the greatest runbacks ever in college football. The 1973 Coach of the Year was Johnny Majors, who gave Pittsburgh their first winning season in a decade. Here was a man who truly loved what he was doing.
I love my business. It's a great profession, and I find that young men frequently will do a great job of getting me back off the canvas, so to speak, when my daubers are down, my chin's on the ground. And this is great to go back on to practice field Tuesday with 18 to 21-year-old young men who will not be defeated and will have the enthusiasm back. And that's one reason I like this business very much. I've been around it all my life, and I hope that I continue to stay in it a few years because I thoroughly love it.
The 1973 Heisman Trophy winner was John Cappelletti, tailback on the unbeaten, untied Penn State team. The only player from that school to win the award. His season's average of 120 yards per game is still a Penn State high, and it was the reason the Nittany Lions were able to post a perfect 12-0 record. Cappelletti was the #1 draft choice of the Los Angeles Rams. Later became a valuable running back for the San Diego Chargers. During his senior year, he was able to produce under pressure during the heart of the season when the schedule was toughest. Against North Carolina State, he scored the winning touchdown in a 6-point victory. He rushed for more than 200 yards. And on the road against Maryland, he controlled the ball and the clock for another 200-yard performance. At the Heisman Award dinner, he spoke with only the aid of a few notes on the back of an envelope. It was one of the most moving moments in the long history of that award, as he dedicated the trophy to his 11-year-old brother Joey, who was suffering from leukemia.
I think a lot of people think that I go through a lot on Saturdays and during the week, as most athletes do. You get your bumps and bruises, and it's a terrific battle out there in the field. But only for me, it's on Saturdays, and it's only in the fall. For Joseph, it's all year round, and it's a battle that's unending with him, and he puts up with much more than I'll ever put up. And I think that this trophy is more of his than it is mine, because he's been a great inspiration to me.
In April of 1975, Joey passed away, but he had had some glorious experiences in his short lifetime, thanks to his older brother, John. '74 didn't start out all that well for the eventual national champions, the Trojans of Southern California. They lost their opening game to Arkansas, but they were perfect from there on. They climaxed the season with a victory in the Rose Bowl. Much of the Trojan success could be credited to this man, Anthony Davis, right out of the tailback mold of Mike Garrett and O.J. Simpson. No two parts of A.D.'s body are ever moving in the same direction at the same time. A mighty tough target. In 1974, he led the Pac-10 Conference in both rushing and in scoring. Anthony Davis became the most celebrated kickoff returner in the history of college football. Remember this one? USC was down 24-6 to Notre Dame at halftime. Davis took this second-half kickoff 2 yards deep in his own end zone. He turned on his tremendous acceleration. He left the members of the Notre Dame team in his wake. He was like the tail of a flying kite. This was the play that lit the fuse that blew Notre Dame apart, with the greatest avalanche of points ever to engulf an Irish team. In that third quarter, the Trojans scored 41 points on their way to a smashing 55-24 victory in a national championship. A.D.'s kneecap shuffle in the end zone was a touchdown ritual that SC fans will never forget. Harvard had its first All-America player in 34 years in 1974. Split end Pat McAnally made the squad. This ex-high school quarterback from California came to Harvard with the intention of playing basketball. Instead, he became the greatest receiver in Harvard history and a Rhodes Scholar finalist. McAnally came up with the most spectacular catches of the entire season. No matter where the ball was thrown, it seems, he was able to grab it and hang on to it, like this. Harvard climaxed his final game with its biggest victory in a quarter of a century, coming from behind to defeat undefeated Yale 21-16. Pat McAnally's outstanding punting ability enabled him to continue his career in professional football as a punter for the Cincinnati Bengals. Maryland still refers to defensive tackle Randy White as its best player ever. The Terrapins won the ACC title when he was a senior. White represented a new breed of player who used weights to develop his body strength. He played at 238. In his senior year, he could bench press 430 pounds, up 170 pounds from when he started as a freshman. White's specialty, one that he worked on constantly in practice, was blocking punts, and he became an expert. Randy White won the Outland Trophy as the nation's best interior lineman, and then he continued his football career with the Dallas Cowboys. Pat Thomas of Texas A&M was just about as tough a 180-pounder as you'll ever find. He just loved to hit. He was the big play man for the Aggies during his 4 years on the squad. He was really tough in the secondary. Get the ball near him, and he'll come to an all-state running back at Plano High School who had great quickness. How is this for quick thinking? And then great reaction. Against Rice, grabbing a deflected ball in midair, and then racing 33 yards for the touchdown. Pat Thomas continued his football career with the L.A. Rams. Quarterback Tom Clements came to Notre Dame when he was only 18 years old. He matured into a masterful tactician. He became only the third Notre Dame quarterback to be named team captain. He started every game for 3 years, and he led the Irish to a 29-5 record, including the 1973 National Championship and that 24-23 victory in the Sugar Bowl over Alabama. Number 24, Joe Washington of Oklahoma, was the absolute textbook example of the true scatback. Barry Switzer, his coach, called him a Houdini type of runner, the fastest man in the world at 15 yards. Coach Darrell Royal of Texas said Washington could go through a keyhole like smoke. In 1974, Joe Washington broke open the Oklahoma State game with this spectacular punt return. Just watch it. He's caught on the sideline. No way to get out. Wrong. Out he pops, escaping down the sidelines, on his way to one of 14 touchdowns that he scored during that year. The 1974 Coach of the Year was Grant Teaff of Baylor, giving the Bears their first Southwest Conference championship in 50 years and a berth in the Cotton Bowl. Archie Griffin became a legend at Ohio State in the 70s. He won 2 Heisman trophies in the decade. There may have been players who were faster or scored more points or who were more spectacular than Archie Griffin. But there never has been a player more durable or able to drain that last inch out of a play like he could do. Because of an injury. He weighed 184 pounds, and he never varied a pound from year to year. He had 31 consecutive games in which he ran for more than 100 yards. And late in the Purdue game in his senior year, he broke Ed Marinero's career rushing record, which he held until Tony Dorsett came along. At the Heisman ceremony, Archie's family and coach heard his sincere acceptance speech.
Football, for me, has meant meeting people and making new friends that will last a lifetime. It has meant learning to work with other people to achieve a common goal using teamwork. Teamwork isn't a very big word. Believe me, without it, none of us stands a chance in life. Football has meant learning to accept life. In athletic competition, you learn to accept both success and failure. And if you can do that, you're definitely ready to make a significant contribution in society today. if today's young people look up to the Heisman Trophy winner the way I did when I was a boy, I promise you, I will do everything in my power to be the greatest example. Thank you.
And Archie Griffin continued to set examples for young people as a professional with the Cincinnati Bengals. Of all the entertaining halftime features that occur in college football, the dance routine by the USC Song Girls was one of the most refreshing we've seen. And after one time through, we'll give them a new electronic look for their encore. Oklahoma was proclaimed the 1975 national champion. The Sooners had another powerful defense, anchored by the third of the Selman brothers, All-America tackle Leroy, who followed Lucius and played on the same team as Dewey. At 256 pounds, Leroy was so strong that just a glancing blow from his big paw often knocked opponents to the ground. Oklahoma was 11-1 on the season, including a victory over the University of Michigan in the Orange Bowl. The Wolverines found out what it was like to feel the Selman crunch. The offensive power was supplied by Joe Washington, who climaxed a brilliant 4-year career with the Sooners by running for a total of 3,995 yards through 4 seasons. Those numbers are likely to remain an Oklahoma record for some time. Washington was a colorful player who painted his shoes silver. And not since Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz has a pair of shoes been more famous as they carried the magical feet of Joe Washington to some unbelievable runs. He carried his many talents into professional ball, and at the beginning of the new decade was a starting running back with the Baltimore Colts. 1975 was a significant year for Tony Dorsett. He made the All-America team for the 3rd year. It was also significant for Marty Akins of Texas, who became college football's first triple-option quarterback to be named to the All-America squad. For 3 years, he started for Coach Darrell Royal, and he was able to carry out the intricacies of the wishbone to its fullest, with that split-second timing needed to react to what the defense was doing. He had to be a strong runner, capable of maneuvering behind the line, but he also had to be able to throw accurately when the situation dictated a pass. Throughout his career, Marty Akins had to take a lot of punishment and a lot of hard shots. At times, it looked like he was running for his very life. He never had any pro aspirations. All he wanted to do was play for Texas. During his 3 years, the Longhorns won 2 Southwest Conference titles and were runners-up once. Today, he's an attorney in Houston. For 3 seasons, Tony Dorsett of Pitt gained more than 1,000 yards. And in 1975, it became obvious that he was within striking distance of Archie Griffin's all-time rushing record, if he could stay healthy. Although 1975 was a winning season for Pitt, with an 8-4 mark, it wasn't as good as what the Panthers and Dorsett were capable of. And we'll see that when we come to 1976, Pitt's and Tony's greatest years. Keep in mind that Dorsett had been named 2 years before as the first freshman All-America player in 29 years. It seemed that after every performance, he got an affectionate hug from his coach, Johnny Major. Chuck Muncie of California was about as loose a player as ever played in the Pac-10 Conference. And how did he get his name, Chuck Muncie?
My real name is Harry Vance Muncie, and like when I was born, my brothers didn't like my name Harry, and so they came out and they said, well, we'll call him Chuck, and ever since I can remember, I've been called Chuck. So, you know, that's what I go by. All my official cards, I put Harry, but as far as people know me, you know, my name is Chuck Muncie.
When he was 8 years old, Chuck Muncie was run over by a tractor trailer. It broke his arms, his legs, and his collarbone. Doctors were pessimistic about his chances of even walking normally. But after spending 6 weeks in a body cast and 4 months recuperating, he began the long road back. How well he accomplished it can be seen in the record books. He became California's greatest ball carrier, rewriting the record set nearly a quarter of a century ago by Johnny Olszewski. After a somewhat turbulent career with New Orleans, he began the 80s with San Diego. The leading rusher of 1975 was Ricky Bell of USC, often described as a linebacker playing tailback. He prepared for the season by running 2 miles each day on the beach in soft sand, wearing combat boots. Although he played the same position as O.J. Simpson, his style was far different. Where O.J. had finesse, Ricky Bell just overpowered people in his relentless, aggressive, forward-moving style of running. As it turned out, the Liberty Bowl of 1975 was Coach John McKay's final game with the Trojans, and it was one of Ricky Bell's most spectacular games. This 76-yard touchdown romp with a pass is still a Liberty Bowl record. McKay's admiration for Ricky Bell was obvious. One of the coach's first desires at Tampa was to get Ricky Bell. And so after Ricky's final season at USC, he became the #1 draft choice of the Buccaneers, reunited with his coach. In 1975, Archie Griffin became the first player in history to win the Heisman Trophy 2 years in a row. The all-time leading rusher at Ohio State credited his coach, Woody Hayes, with his own success. This was Archie's run against Purdue, which enabled him to break Ed Marinero's NCAA career rushing record. Play stopped. He was congratulated by everybody. And he was carried off the field on the shoulders of his teammates. Later, the officials gave him the game ball. His coach, Woody Hayes, was named Coach of the Year for the 3rd time in his career. Before the unfortunate Gator Bowl incident, which forced his early retirement from football, Woody's 28 years at Ohio State produced 13 Big Ten titles and 3 national championships.
We only have 2 rules on the squad. You know what they are? First one is no haters, black or white. No haters. We won't have it. And number 2, no drugs. And that's just it. No drugs. If a fellow is on drugs and he's legally found to be so, he's off. And he knows it. Because the day that people can talk around and say, well, Woody lets them get by with it, it's all over. Because a lot of people don't use it because they realize that there are certain people that still have certain stops. We just don't go for it. But those are 2 rules we have. No haters, no drugs.
There was another All-America player from Ohio State in 1975 who deserves mention, defensive back Tim Fox. He was the cornerstone of the Buckeye defensive secondary, which allowed only 1 touchdown per game. No moment will be remembered as long as this one against Illinois, when he returned an intercepted pass for a touchdown. And then because he was tired of seeing players doing dances in the end zone, he did a front flip to celebrate the occasion. Fox continued his career in professional football with the New England Patriots. Pitt made history in 1976. The Panthers won the national championship of college football. Their coach, Johnny Majors, was coach of the year, and Tony Dorsett won the Heisman, the triple crown of college football, an all-time first. Defensive tackle Randy Holloway was named to the All-America squad, and after graduation, he continued his football career with the Minnesota Vikings. In '76, he was double and sometimes triple teamed, and because of that, his coach Jackie Sherrill devised the peekaboo defense to mask Holloway's presence on the field. He played every position on the defensive line and was often left unblocked in the confusion, a fatal mistake by the offense. Quarterback sacks were his specialty. He had 32 in his career. In Pitt's opening game against Notre Dame, Dorsett had another great day against the Irish at South Bend. He led the Panthers to a 31-10 victory, and in the locker room following the game, I talked to him.
How good is Pittsburgh, in your opinion?
Well, I couldn't tell you how good we are, but I can tell you this: we have unlimited talent, and we can go as far as we want to go. You know, I think we have the team here We have the talent, the potential, the credentials. We have all the tools that's qualified to have a top contender, a national power and whatnot. And, you know, it's going to take a job on us. The guys staying in the right mental frame of mind, keeping the right attitude. You know, we beat Notre Dame, but, you know, we can live on this for tonight and maybe tomorrow. And next week we got to start getting ready for the Yellow Jackets.
Although there were 10 games ahead, Pitt took them right in stride, and Dorsett ran like a meteor through them all. By the end of the '76 season, he had run farther and more often than any runner in collegiate history, scoring 59 touchdowns during his amazing 4-year career. His career points of 356 is still an all-time high. He became the first player to rush for more than 6,000 yards. He wound up with a total of 6,003. His brilliant career continues with the Dallas Cowboys. Gifford Nielsen of Brigham Young University gained his All-America status as a junior. During that year, he threw the ball 111 times before he was intercepted, and that's an all-time record. His father was a BYU basketball player back in the 40s. That was what Gifford concentrated on, basketball. After all, he was 6'5". But someone convinced him that a 6'5" quarterback would draw much more attention than a 6'5" basketball player. His height was a great advantage, enabling him to spot receivers over gigantic on-rushing linemen. Although his senior year was cut short after 4 games because of knee surgery, Gifford Nielsen recovered sufficiently to continue in professional ball. Going into the 80s, he was the backup quarterback of the Houston Oilers. '76 was a noteworthy year for linebacker Jerry Robinson of UCLA. It was the first of 3 years in which he was to be named an All-America player. He wasn't particularly big, 6'3", 208 pounds. In fact, he spent his freshman year as a split end. But once the Bruins switched him to linebacker, he knew right then that's where he wanted to be, where all the action was, on every defensive play. Robinson became UCLA's first unanimous All-America player, and then went on to stardom in the pro game with the Philadelphia Eagles. Crosstown rival USC produced a couple of defensive standouts in '76. One of them was defensive tackle Gary Jeter. The Trojans were determined, after Missouri scored 46 points on them in the season's opener, which, by the way, was their only loss, they were going to be stingy from then on. They lived up to their vow. They allowed an average of only 8 points per game for the rest of the way, and Gary Jeter, who later played with the New York Giants, was one of the main reasons. Safety man Dennis Thurman was another. He was to the secondary on defense what Jeter was to the forward wall. Indispensable. 5'11", 170, he was everywhere on the field. He led the nation in yards returned with interceptions. And against UCLA, he scampered 85 yards after seizing a fumble in midair. He's now a cornerback with the Dallas Cowboys. Ricky Bell repeated as an All-America back in 1976. He had picked up 6 additional pounds from the previous season without sacrificing any speed. This made him all the more devastating at 215. Unfortunately, his senior year was a disappointment to him. A number of injuries prevented him from attaining the goals that he had set for himself. But when he was right and he was healthy, he was unstoppable. Fortunately, his injuries were not serious, and he was the top choice of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers after graduation. Oklahoma State's Cowboys boasted their greatest running star ever in Terry Miller. He had 19 consecutive 100-yard games. He scored 49 career touchdowns. In '76, he led Oklahoma State to a co-championship of the Big 8 and a Tangerine Bowl victory over BYU. He repeated on the All-America squad in his senior year and wound up as the #3 rusher in the nation. In all, he broke 11 school records during his fabulous career with the Cowboys. And he continued his career in professional ball with the Buffalo Bills. Houston produced the Southwest Conference Player of the Year in '76 and the Lombardi Trophy winner of that season, defensive tackle Wilson Whitley. At 6'3" and 268 pounds, Whitley was the ideal defensive obstacle, and he came along just at the right time, Houston's first year in the Southwest Conference football race. He led the Cougars to a co-championship of the conference and a berth in the Cotton Bowl. He continues to make his presence felt as nose tackle with the Cincinnati Bengals. One of college football's great punt returners of the 70s came out of Iowa State, All-America Luther Blue. It'd be hard to match this 95-yard punt return against Nebraska, which broke the backs of the Cornhuskers and which set up the Big Eight for a late-season championship fight that eventually wound up in a three-way tie. Blue averaged more than 21 yards every time he touched the ball on pass receptions and kick returns. He played with the Detroit Lions until injury ended his career at the end of the decade. When the 76 season was over, there wasn't much of a question about how the balloting for the Heisman Trophy would turn out. Tony Dorsett won in a landslide.
I'm deeply thankful to be chosen to represent the Heisman Trophy. And I'm just hoping right now that the good Lord will help me live up to such an outstanding award.
When Tony Dorsett passed the all-time rushing mark of Archie Griffin with this run against Navy in the 7th game of the season, he really wasn't prepared for the kind of a celebration that occurred. He was mobbed by his teammates, and the cheering roared in his ears. But things did get a little out of hand. Somewhere, smothered under that mountain of humanity, was the man who, going into the 80s, was still college football's all-time leading rusher. For the second time in the decade, Notre Dame was named the national champion in college football. Following in the footsteps of Dave Casper, tight end Ken McAfee was the personification of what a tight end should be, a solid blocker and a sure receiver. His father didn't want to let Ken Jr. get too wrapped up with just football. In fact, he forbade him to play the game until he got to junior high school. Instead, the younger McAfee took piano and dancing lessons. Can you believe that? Well, it could be that the end result of that was very quick hands and feet.
I've always wanted to play football. Of course, I grew up around the game, and it's always been a tremendous experience for me. And my father, of course, played at the University of Alabama, but once I visited Notre Dame, I felt that it had everything I wanted here. It was a small college atmosphere, yet very highly accredited academically. And it was very, of course, football, I think, speaks for itself. And it's just the total situation that I felt was the right place for me to come.
McAfee and Joe Montana made a great combination for the Irish. In the 77 game against USC, they really clicked. McAfee caught 8 passes for 97 yards and 2 touchdowns. Defensively, it's doubtful if Notre Dame ever had a better player than Ross Browner. He won the Outland Trophy in 77 as well as the Lombardi Trophy, the highest awards made to collegiate linemen. He grew from a 175-pound high school player in Warren, Ohio, to a 6'3", 248-pound giant at Notre Dame. It's a pleasure just to watch him at work. Ross Browner was a master at his trade, destroying enemy ball carriers and seeking out a loose ball to wherever he may have detoured it, like in the end zone for a touchdown. The Cincinnati Bengals continue to utilize his tremendous talents in the 80s. Somehow Stanford University seems to come up with the most outstanding passers year after year in college ball. Quarterback Guy Benjamin added his name to a list that includes the likes of Frankie Albert, John Brody, and Jim Plunker. In his senior year, he led the nation in passing, was second in total offense. The Cardinals were 9-3 on the season and scored a victory over LSU in the Sun Bowl. Benjamin's 63% completion record was so impressive, he was bound to wind up in professional ball on the roster of the New Orleans Saints. In that Sun Bowl game for LSU was one of the nation's finest running backs in 77, Charles Alexander, nicknamed Alexander the Great. In high school, he played 4 years under 4 coaches, learning 4 different offenses. He wasn't heavily recruited, but Coach Charlie McClendon liked his 9.4 speed. Eventually, Charles Alexander attained All-America honors and went on to be a running back with the Cincinnati Bengals. He'll be remembered at LSU with such other great ball carriers as Cannon, Taylor, Stovall, and Van Gilbert. Another player to come out of the Southeastern Conference in '77 to gain national honors was Alabama's Ozzie Newsome. Coach Bear Bryant called him the best end in Alabama history, including even Bear's teammate, the great Don Hudson. When you see the catches that Newsome comes up with, you can understand why his teammates labeled him simply Oz the Wizard, the most effective receiver in SEC history, averaging 20 yards a catch. Ozzie's pro career should continue to flourish as a 232-pound tight end to the Cleveland Browns. The Coach of the Year in 1977 was Lou Holtz of Arkansas. In his first year in the Southwest Conference, he led the Razorbacks to an 11-1 record, including a tremendous upset victory over Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl. Number 77 of Texas was worn by defensive tackle Brad Shearer, the Outland Trophy winner. At 6'4" and 255, he was the spearhead in a defense that yielded only 5 touchdowns rushing all season long and only 91 yards per game. He was the first draft choice of the Chicago Bears, who have long had a reputation for tapping defensive greats. Brad's Longhorn teammate, Earl Campbell, won the Heisman Trophy. It's rare when both the Outland and the Heisman winners are from the same team. In '77, Earl Campbell became the first player ever from the Southwest Conference to win the national rushing title. He was another example of a player attaining greatness only after overcoming adversity. His father died when Earl was only 9. His mother had to raise 11 children. His home was later destroyed by a fire. There's a plaque on the wall of his bedroom at school. It read, "Keep me going, Lord." He lived by that motivation. And it was further revealed in the films of his games, where coaches' reports indicated that 2/3 of his yardage came after being hit the first time. Campbell became the only player in Texas's illustrious football history to win the Heisman Trophy. And judging by his performance during the early years with the Houston Oilers, he was the right choice. In fact, in his rookie year, Earl Campbell was Rookie of the Year in the NFL. He remains a legend at Texas. In 1978, Alabama was proclaimed the national champion by the AP, despite a 24-14 loss to Southern California. Arizona State helped Bama's cause by knocking off USC during the regular season. The Tide had excellent offensive balance with the passing of quarterback Jeff Rutledge and the running of number 22, Tony Nathan. Nathan was a 4-year letterman for Coach Bryant. In his senior year, he led the team in rushing. And had he not shared the burden of running with Major Ogilvy, Steve Whitman, Billy Jackson, and Lou Eichner, no doubt he would have been named to the All-America squad. As it was, Nathan wasn't disappointed at all in missing personal honors. He had his glory by being on a national championship team. In '78, the Penn State defense was anchored by number 54, Bruce Clark, a 246-pound giant who delighted in tossing quarterbacks around or simply obliterating them. Coach Joe Paterno called Clark the most dominating player Penn State ever had. And there are a few ex-quarterbacks roaming around who would agree with that. The quarterback on that '78 Penn State squad was Chuck Fusina, who began the new decade with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In his sophomore year, Penn State was floundering, able to win only 1 out of the first 4 games. So Paterno decided to start Fusina. From then on, all through Chuck's career, he never lost the job, and he moved the team to a 27-3 record thereafter. If you'll remember, Penn State was right in the running for the championship honors in '78, too, losing only to Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, compiling an 11-1 record. Fusina had that one great asset of a passing quarterback. He could deliver the ball with zip. Once he spotted his receiver, his leads were perfect. And the end result was 6 more points for the Nittany Lions. For his own coaching efforts, Joe Paterno was named Coach of the Year by both his fellow coaches and the football writers. The former Brown University quarterback was an assistant at Penn State under Rip Engel. He became the head coach in '66. His teams won 81% of their games and were ranked in the nation's top 10 for 8 of the 10 years of the 70s. Football coaches are somewhat reluctant to entrust a young player with a lot of defensive responsibility. That was not the case in Ken Easley. UCLA's All-America defensive back was trusted right from the day he began as a freshman. The Bruins have counted on him to make the big play. Whether slashing through to nail the ball carrier like he does here on Charles White, or covering on pass defense, or playing linebacker, or playing the cornerback, or playing free safety, didn't make any difference. He covered more ground on the field than any other player who ever performed in the defensive secondary. It's one of the reasons he'll become the first 4-time All-Pac-10 player before his career finishes. Ken Easley has the size at 6'2" and 202 pounds to play anywhere on a team, and no matter where he would play, he would make national headlines. Just look at his moves when he's carrying the ball. His lightning-like reactions have enabled him to come up with the football so many times during his career. And so as we head into the 80s, just mark down the name of Ken Easley. He could become one of professional football's best in the next decade. The greatest running back in the history of North Carolina State, Ted Brown, climaxed his career in 1978 by establishing an even dozen school records. His number 23 jersey has been retired forever. His 4,600 yards rushing established an Atlantic Coast Conference record. His team went 9-3 in his senior year, including a victory over Pitt in the Tangerine Bowl. Ted Brown continued his football career after graduation as a running back with the Minnesota Vikings. SMU's wide receiver, Emmanuel Talbert, was hardly impressive physically. He was 5'10", 180 pounds. And yet, during his career, he caught 171 passes for 2,784 yards and 25 touchdowns. Those are conference records in the Southwest Conference, and they could stand for quite some time. Talbert defied the odds on becoming an All-America selection on a losing team. Just doesn't happen very often. But in '71, the Ponies were 4-6-1, and Talbert still was recognized for his great achievements. There was another player in 1978 who defied the odds of being a starting quarterback for every game for 4 straight years. Rick Leach of the University of Michigan. He became the most productive player in the history of the Big Ten. He accounted for 82 touchdowns, 48 by passing, 34 by rushing. His ability to run as well as pass enabled him to lead Michigan to a share of 3 Big Ten titles and 1 second-place finish in his 4 years. He won the Silver Football Award in 1978, given annually by the Chicago Tribune to the most valuable player in the Big Ten. Rick Leach is the only player in football history ever to score more than 200 points running and more than 200 points passing. Although he was drafted by the Denver Broncos, he decided to concentrate on baseball. And in the decade of the 80s, the Detroit Tigers are hoping that he'll help them win the American League pennant and the World Series. At Michigan, his football exploits live on in the record books and in the memories of those who saw him play. If the Tigers are hoping for Leach to lead them to the top in baseball, the Detroit Lions are certainly counting on their great Oklahoma All-America player and Heisman Trophy winner of 1978, Billy Sims, to lead them to greatness in the National Football League. At Oklahoma, Sims became a legend. But it really didn't happen until his junior year, when all of a sudden he just exploded. He averaged nearly 8 yards per carry. He scored 20 touchdowns. And he had 4 games in which he went over the 200-yard mark. It was sheer pleasure to watch him run, whether in the open, burning a defensive halfback, or getting the tough yards inside. Billy was raised by his grandmother in Hooks, Texas. And when she passed away during his freshman season at Oklahoma, he nearly dropped out of school. He was so depressed. But he gathered up his courage, and he dedicated himself to becoming the best athlete he could possibly become, knowing that his grandmother would be proud of all of his success. Would she ever? One thing Billy really enjoyed was going airborne, as if being shot out of a cannon. He said, "I just love to fly." The high point of his life came when he was named as the Heisman Trophy winner of 1978. When it was announced, he took the news gracefully and with a certain amount of surprise.
My heart stopped beating, I know that. It seemed like it. You know, it's just, I don't know, I know Hooks won't be the same, that's where I'm from.
One last look at the graceful yet powerful style that Billy Sims displayed. And that dive into the end zone. After which, a hug from his teammate and All-America guard Greg Roberts, who had cleared so many holes for him on the road to glory at Oklahoma. The Crimson Tide of Alabama clinched their second straight national championship with a convincing 24-9 victory over Arkansas in the Sugar Bowl. Again in '79, it was a stalwart defense led by E.J. Jr. that made the difference. That, together with a devastating offense led by Major Ogilvy, gave the Tide a perfect 12-0 season record. In fact, Alabama was the only team to come away from the regular season and the bowls with a perfect mark. Although the national championship went to Alabama, the Coach of the Year honors were won by Earl Bruce of Ohio State. In his first year as head coach of his alma mater, the team went through the season undefeated and then lost to USC in that Rose Bowl thriller, 17-16. The nation's premier quarterback of 1979 was Mark Wilson of BYU. It was really amazing that he even played during the season, let alone make All-America. 3 weeks before the start of the schedule, he was stricken with a ruptured appendix. He began the season 25 pounds under his normal playing weight, and yet he managed to lead his team to an upset win over Texas A&M in the first game. That was an indication of what was to come. He led the nation in total offense, and he was responsible for 32 touchdowns. In his final game against San Diego State for the WAC championship, he connected for 4 touchdowns in his first 5 passes. Mark Wilson was drafted by the Oakland Raiders, and going into the 80s, he was learning the ropes behind Jim Plunkett. He plans a law career after he tries pro ball. He's called the incredible Hugh Green, unanimous All-America selection as a junior. Hugh Green, defensive end, tackle, and linebacker of the Pitt Panthers. Hugh Green is about as destructive a one-man machine as college football has ever seen. His number 99 seems to be everywhere on the field. Going into his final season, he already had made 350 tackles and had 33 quarterback sacks for more than 200 lost yards. At 6'2" and 220 pounds, Green is rock hard. He hits with a finality that has drawn the awe of opposing players. His very presence has caused teams to run away from his position, thereby weakening their attack. Observers are certain of one prediction, that Hugh Green will be a first-round draft choice by some very lucky NFL team. Vegas Ferguson of Notre Dame came from Richmond, Indiana, from a family of 10 children who were raised by their grandparents. He became the greatest runner in the history of Notre Dame football, surpassing the marks established by the immortal George Gipp, and in later years, Jerome Evans. His versatility in running made him the great that he was. He could outrun some, and those that he couldn't, he would fake out. And when he was trapped, he could lower his shoulder and run through a defender. All Vegas Ferguson ever thought about was reaching the end zone. He tried to get there however he could, and his methods were sound because nobody else at Notre Dame ever did it any better than this man. Ferguson should have a long and illustrious career in professional football. His serious approach to the game and lack of any prima donna attitude made him a top choice of the New England Patriots. Ken Marjoram of Stanford climaxed his junior year by being named as a consensus All-America player in 1979 as a wide receiver. He's called the young man with the suction cup hands. Get the ball near him, it just sticks to him like glue. He's the top touchdown receiver in Stanford history. Despite being double and triple teamed by opponents, he continues to make catches that are in the spectacular category. Even when he occasionally misses, it isn't because he doesn't try. '79 saw a 6'5", 250-pound tight end from Nebraska tabbed as the #1 draft choice of the Atlanta Falcons come into his own. Junior Miller was just about as perfect a physical specimen as one could hope for. His coach, Tom Osborne, said that Miller had that uncanny knack of turning short passes into touchdowns. He certainly is the Cornhuskers' top tight end in history with 13 career touchdowns. This was one of his most remarkable games against Penn State. After taking this pass for a touchdown to bring the Huskers to a 14-7 deficit, he got completely behind the defense, and Tim Hager found him with this 70-yard bomb. This was the touchdown that enabled Nebraska to tie the score at 14-14. That took the heart out of Penn State, and the Big Red went on to score a resounding 42-17 victory. Brad Budde became the first freshman player to start for Southern California since World War II. For 4 years, he was absolutely brilliant at his offensive guard spot. His father, Ed Budde, was a former great at Michigan State and later an all-pro guard with the Kansas City Chiefs. When Brad was 13, he was lifting weights and working out. He wanted to play football so badly, nothing would deny him the chance. He could block any way that was called on, straight ahead, lead or post, pass block, or simply move ahead to bury an opponent so that backs like Charles White could go flying overhead. To no one's surprise, he was the first-round draft choice of Kansas City, where he became a starter in his rookie season. His teammate, Charles White, climaxed his career with the Trojans by winning the Heisman Trophy in 1979, following in the footsteps of previous Trojan winners, O.J. Simpson and Mike Garrett. When his career was over with the Trojans, he had moved into the #2 spot in all-time rushing behind Tony Dorsett. In Charles White's senior year, he led the nation in rushing, and he became the top runner in the history of the Pac-10, and that's a conference famous for producing outstanding running backs. His coach, John Robinson, called him the toughest player he'd ever seen. He was at his best in the fourth quarter, when most people were beginning to get tired. And it was in the fourth quarter against UCLA in his senior year, on this play, that Charles White broke the conference rushing record, and it was acknowledged on the Coliseum scoreboard. Charles White was taken as a first-round draft pick by Cleveland. But no matter what happens to him in pro ball, his days at USC will never be forgotten by his many admirers. He had the distinction of being the best in college football in 1979. In the 70s, there was one man who stood atop all in the coaching profession, Paul Bear Bryant of Alabama. He became the only coach in the history of the game to win more than 100 victories during the period of 1 decade. In the 70s, his Crimson Tide won 103. Under the watchful eyes of Coach Bryant, who stands atop his famous tower in Tuscaloosa, the Alabama players go through the rigors of practice. It's the hard work here that enabled them to win 8 SEC titles and 2 national championships in the 70s. At the close of the decade, before the start of the '80 season, we visited Tuscaloosa and asked Bear about his health.
Oh, I feel great, Bill. I spent some time out there resting, losing some weight. To be honest about it, I gave my heart too much to do. And thankfully, there wasn't anything wrong with my heart. It's just what I was given it to do, according to the doctor, that it wasn't quite strong enough to do the things I was asked to do. So after losing some weight and taking on a special diet and so forth, I feel great. Maybe around for 100 years, you can't tell.
During the 80s, Paul Bear Bryant could become the winningest coach in the history of college football, which may very well qualify him for being coach of the century. The game of the decade took place on November the 25th, 1971. It was a cold and overcast day in Norman, Oklahoma at Owen Field. There couldn't have been a more dramatic setting as the visiting Cornhuskers, coached by Bob Devaney, ranked #1 of the nation, squared off against the #2 team, Oklahoma, coached by Chuck Fairbanks, the nation's leading offensive and scoring machine. No less than 9 All-America players were on the field this day. 63,000 fans were there to watch the classic. The vaunted Nebraska defense was awesome. Repeatedly, All-America guard Rich Glover, number 79, broke in to destroy the Oklahoma wishbone attack before it could get started. When Glover wasn't messing up the Sooners, defensive end Willie Harper, number 81, added his huge frame to the mayhem. Defensive pressure forced the Sooners to punt early. And who will ever forget this punt return by Johnny Rogers of Nebraska? His start-stop, double-clutching style of running was never more apparent or more effective than it was on this 72-yard return for a Nebraska touchdown. With just 3 minutes and 32 seconds gone in the game, Nebraska was off to a 7-0 lead. The Sooners narrowed that to 7-3 with a 30-yard field goal by John Carroll in the first quarter. But in the second period, the Huskers were on the move again. Fullback Jeff Kinney powers his way into the end zone from the 1-yard line, and the score goes to 14-3 Nebraska, with the Big Red fans waving their #1 signs with very good reason. But in the closing minutes of that first half, Oklahoma mounted a sustained drive that carried them down to the 2-yard line. From there, Jack Mildren, working the option to perfection, carries the ball into the end zone, climaxing a brilliant 80-yard march. With 5 minutes and 10 seconds to go in the first half, it's Nebraska 14, Oklahoma 10. With a little less than 1 minute to play, the Sooners have the ball on their own 33. Mildren fires a perfect pass to John Harrison for 43 yards and a first down at the 24. And then, with just 5 seconds remaining on the clock, Mildren has time for one play. He goes to his favorite receiver, looking for Harrison. He lofts the ball to him, and Harrison makes a great catch for the go-ahead touchdown. Halftime score, Oklahoma 17, Nebraska 14. The game was indeed living up to everything that had been predicted about it. The Cornhuskers came out in the third quarter, determined to control the football. Taking advantage of an OU fumble, Jerry Taggy moved the team down the field with a masterful set of calls. He himself played a great part in that drive with his beautifully executed fake and a run of 39 yards down to the Sooner 3, first and goal to go. And on the very next play, Jeff Kinney spins into the end zone, and the Cornhuskers are back on top, 21-17. 8 minutes to go in the third quarter. It wasn't long until they were threatening again. Taggy passes to Rogers, who squirms and maneuvers for every possible yard. 20 in all, and eventually is tossed out of bounds in the Oklahoma 16. One more pass to Rogers, moves to the 1, and from there, the Sooners couldn't keep getting out of the end zone as Nebraska scores 14 unanswered points in the third quarter to take the lead, 28-17. Oklahoma continued to rally under the strong leadership of Mildren. For the 4th straight time in this drive, he carried the ball himself, and this time, it's an Oklahoma touchdown. The Husker lead now narrowed to 28-24, 28 seconds to go in the third quarter. And then early in the fourth quarter came the break the Sooners had been hoping for. Taggy is hit hard by Danny Mullen. He fumbles the ball, and Lucius Selman comes up with it for Oklahoma. 11 minutes and 47 seconds to play. After calling 10 out of 11 plays on the ground, Mildren crossed up the defense, which was expecting another run on 4th and 5. Instead, he sailed a soft pass to Harrison for the Oklahoma touchdown. The Huskers were in a spot, trailing 31-28 with less than 7 minutes to play. The strategy was discussed by Coach Devaney and quarterback Taggy. The most reliable runner in Nebraska history, Jeff Kinney, was called on. He delivered with this 17-yard run, breaking 3 tackles. getting the ball into Oklahoma territory to the 48. And then the key play in this drive, maybe in the ball game. 3rd down and 8 at the OU 46. Taggy scrambles, looks for Rogers. Johnny makes a falling down catch. Good for 11 yards and a first down. The drive is alive. Just a little over 4 minutes to go now, with the pressure mounting to unbelievable proportions. With the Sooners concentrating on stopping Kinney, Taggy slips the ball to Rogers inside, and Johnny picks up 7 to the Oklahoma 15. Then after Kinney moved it to the 8, came a play they still talk about to this day. Kinney is hit. When he falls to the ground, the ball bounces loose. The officials ruled the play was dead, that Kinney was on the ground when the ball was fumbled. And even though Lucius Selman came up with it for Oklahoma, he had to give it back. It was still Nebraska's ball on the 6th, 2nd down. And then with just 1 minute and 38 seconds to play, Jeff Kinney cracked into the end zone for his 4th touchdown of the game. The Cornhusker fans went wild as the bright lights of the scoreboard blinked. Nebraska 35, Oklahoma 31. Seldom have two teams had as many emotional highs and lows in one game as they had in this one. Everyone came away drawn and limp, just like the players and the coaches, from the game of the decade. Well, that's it. A look backwards to the golden decade of college football in the 70s. Sure does bring back lots of memories, doesn't it? This is Bill Fleming, thanking you very much for adding this tape to your sports library. I should like to tell you, however, that there is one play that you haven't seen yet that we thought was the most inventive play that we saw all during that decade. Watch, and I think you'll agree. As Shakespeare might have written it, exeunt all with the ball.